All right, so I'm working on trying to hook up this setup inside of an actual one of our actual applications. And one of the big challenges that I run into is I need environment variables from another app. So when I try and federate code across, if I'm trying to pull it out of one of our other code bases, I also need the environment variables for it. Before I was using this really convoluted system that would do all the injection manually, but now that I'm handing this over to Webpack, I need to get it to the point where before I try and load the module in the first place, so when I refresh the page here, I need to get it to a stage where it's going to be able to load these environment variables without causing some kind of a critical failure, like what I experience, in a scenario like this, where it's unable to determine if it needs something or not. So usually I had this big thing called federated component where I would pass in the logic, so it would look something like like that I would pass into it, and that's how I would go and get whatever it is that I need. But now with trying to use an import, the public configs are kind of like a JavaScript module that's available. So by the time that this factory gets executed, it's going to anticipate that the environment variable already exists. So I have no opportunity to inject the environment variables before Federation actually executes the module, which would resolve the module tree, find out that public config does not exist, and at that point it's too late for me to do something like go and inject the variables after I get the component. Because by getting the component, I have the module exports of it, which means whatever it was requiring has already been required, and it's too late for me to try and hook in and say, well, here are the variables that I load after the fact. So how I plan to solve that is I'm going to jump over here into our platform packages, and I'm going to use a similar tactic I'm using in server-side rendering, but I'm just going to do it for this one. Here I'm not using anything fancy like URLs or anything like that, but I render the remotes into the document, and then it just looks for it on the window scope and it's done. So the plan is I'm going to take whatever somebody inputs into the system, I'm going to take that, and then I'm going to run it through this loop, convert it into the format that I need it in, and then I'm going to attempt to try and perform the injection methods that I want on the fly. So we'll see how this actually ends up panning out, but it should work as far as I can as far as I can tell. So to save time here, I'm going to just close all this down, go in here, look up Lululemon. All right, cool. So then I'm going to start with just, cool, I return my accumulator. I'm going to log the remote. That should give me the object entries for it. And then let's see, I get my accumulator, which is inside of here. It's going to complain about, yeah, okay, whatever. It's going to complain about that. So that's the function argument. Then the second argument I have on here is right. Okay, cool. So I'll just prettify it. All right, so I just want to see what it ends up spitting out. So I will run a rush build on this just to regenerate everything that I need. In this case, this is part of the Webpack build, so I'm going to go in here and replace it inside of Webpack, overwrite it there, and then I'm going to kick a dev build off. And what it should do is I'm hoping it should now show me a loop where it's looping over whatever the configs are. There we go. So there's the remote. It's just called dar, which is fine. But I can't have it be dar forever. So then what I'm going to do is just say, okay, remote. Let's see. We're gonna call this const. Let's see. Okay, yeah, const remote global equals remote 0, and then we'll have the container, which is going to be the first argument of it. So now I've got my key value pair, and then what I would do, I'm just trying to figure out the proper way to do this, because I need to find where my environment variable location is inside a Webpack, which is a little trickier because I'm going to make the runtime do all of this before it actually resolves the remote in the first place. So the plan here is I'm going to say that the accumulator is the remote, let's see, the remote global, and that's not actually the right word for it. It should be alias, because that's what it's referred to internally. And then the remote, the container in this place is actually just a string because it's already on the window for me. But what I'm going to do is say, cool, it's going to equal, go to my good old promise new promise syntax, and I'm going to give it a custom promise to resolve, and basically this will act as middleware in between when Webpack asks for federation and when Webpack receives the interface. So with this wired in place, what I should be able to do now is prepare the logic that I would want around making this happen in the first place. So we're just going to say that it's going to be fetch env vars for right now, then, and because I'm already attaching these, I'm already injecting them by hand on the window, my resolver here should just be me taking the original key that's passed in, so the container, and I should just be able to pop it back in here. So then I would say that I'm going to resolve it to window dot the container. I'm just trying to think if I need to stringify this at all. I don't think I do, because it's going to emit that in the right order, which is more or less what I want it to do. And yeah, so it's going to create now a remote with a value being a promise new promise. I'm going to fetch the environment variables, which I'm going to pause to load that logic in so that I don't really expose any of it. But then the idea is it'll inject stuff into the page so that code coming from another remote, when it depends on public environment variables from its host location, I have them available in the location that it's getting loaded under a certain namespace so that we have no collisions in play. So give me one moment while I add the, while I, actually go and create a function that does that fetch for me. So I added some logic here, some fake endpoints for the time being, but the idea is I'm going to take the federation config remotes, I'm going to transduce them, I'm going to use promise new promise, go get environment variables, basically inject like a script that comes from an API endpoint. Then, I'll first try and fetch from the render endpoint, get JSON. If I'm unable to get JSON, I will fall back and use the render endpoint with as script to get around any CORS issues, assuming that I can get the script and it gets injected and all of that is available. Then finally, I will resolve the public config container that is sitting on the document in the first place. And that's how I'll wire it up. So I'm just right now logging the transduced remotes out, so it's still not wired into the system, but if I come over here, this is now what dar equals. So instead of it being dar with a string of dar, it's dar promise new promise, go get environment variables, fetch from my endpoint, then resolve the public config that I want, and say it's injecting it, inject it in development mode, and then finally it would be, after you go get the variables, then resolve the window.remote, because the remote is being server-side rendered either way. So now what we are going to try to do is actually hook this thing up. So instead of this transduced remotes being that, I would go back in here, and I'm going to try and wire it up to the actual application. So then it would be federation remotes equals the new transduced remotes. And now what I should see on this next build is it should still not work, but I should see in my network call here, I should see it try to go off to hit some endpoint, which means that Webpack is now talking to an API prior to resolving the remote. The reason that this is useful is I could use environment variables to power anything and repoint these remotes and what they resolve to any Webpack container that I want at any point, from anywhere, from anything. So I'm not like hard-coded or locked to whatever I have during the config. I can make something like this where the remote that ends up getting used is completely dynamic. So rolling it back could be done by this kind of thing, just doing an API call, figuring out what remote it wants and using it, and I could roll them forward and roll them back without ever redeploying the application itself. So it's been built. I am going to copy ESM into here, overwrite it, and now I'm going to run the development mode again. Just confirm, yes, they're wired up. Yes, this goes through my accumulator. Go get variables. The container is set. All right, federation is now kicking into place. It'll still fail because I'm not using a real endpoint. When I pause the video again, I will actually wire it to a real endpoint, and then I can test if now it's pulling in environment variables that it needs before module federation is ever actually connected to Webpack. And effectively, this is like how you can create Webpack middleware, where whatever I want it to go off and do, I can essentially make it do ahead of time without having to go in here and actually perform anything in particular that I'm not trying to make it go off and do. So I'm not seeing my some endpoint show up here, so I'm just going to confirm that this is written out correctly and that the federation options are set at the appropriate point. I get what's exposed, I loop over my exposure context, and then it should drill into this. So if I hop over here and look at my error boundaries, it's still complaining that the substring wasn't set and that it wasn't able to find what it wants. So I'm going to search here for data-webpack. Okay, data webpack does not exist, which is fine. So that would lead me to believe that somewhere in here I am not firing off my my host configuration. So the most likely cause of that is this manipulation is happening in the wrong spot. So I'm probably inheriting this from the parent build. So what I'll need to go over here and do is take this and hoist it up into my main Webpack application. So I'm going to pause that, move it into the actual Webpack config, because federation has to be configured on the host and has to be configured on the remote. In this scenario, I believe I'm only configuring it on the remote portion here, so the host still doesn't know what's happening. Alright, so I've moved it over, so it's sitting in the main plugin itself, so this is what the host is going to be configured with. It's going to get this configuration, then inside of the sidecar for, in my new plugin, this is all centralized under one plugin, so I don't have to have all this kind of splits, but this ought to do for what I'm trying to make it do. But pretty much I add the promise new promise layers in both locations. And now if I run this build here, what it should hopefully end up giving me is I should see some entry point show up in what ends up trying to get requested. Once that's done, I can then wire it into the actual application. and then I will be able to manually I'll be able to intercept this, load anything additional that I want into the application layers ahead of time. And before any federated stuff attempts to happen, it's first going to go off and load and resolve whatever I pretty much telling it to load and resolve. This could be useful if you wanted to say like stitch Sentry or anything else in. It's a great way to add a middleware layer here. The only drawback is I can't use like require inside of this because the string is taken and moved directly into Webpack and exported out exactly as is. So I'm stuck with just vanilla JavaScript, or I need to traverse the prototype chain to get access to the Webpack graph, but that's a very non-standard way of trying to load anything through the Webpack application layer. Usually that's not a practice that would be encouraged at all. So we'll see if it is able to pull up anything on my fetch calls here. Otherwise, I might have some other plugin issue with how this application attempts to load itself to begin with. So I get all of my JS in here, which is right. I believe the application is now paused because it's attempting to perform a fetch that it's not able to perform, which kind of makes sense. So if I go back in here and just traverse over how I am configuring it, it looks like my host is getting stuck because of some way that I am manipulating this. I say the remotes are the transduced remotes, which is right. It goes in here, it's going to get its fake entry layer from here. I'm going to split it out, stitch it back together, and then pass it onto the Webpack plugin itself. Missing argument and list, that would definitely do it. So on my fetch, of course, I didn't serialize these. So, I think the best way to do this would be to stringify it just to be extra sure it's going to always be a string and you don't end up in quirks where it's, for whatever reason, not. So it looks like on this one I already have it in a string, so it should be fine. I believe this one is the culprit. I'm going to go in here, stringed, and I'm just going to stringify this one as well. Build it one last time. Cool. Make sure my IDE gets the latest of this. Go in here, replace the variable that I want inside of here, overwrite it, and kill and start this again. And then I should end up seeing it try to make an AJAX call to my fake entry point, as long as I've configured some entry point, and then this one still's got it. So so that should bring it to life, but we will see if the build is satisfied. Okay, so build's still coming up. Server looks like it's nearly done. And so usually what I would do is tap into the Webpack compiler itself, where I can get pretty much anything that I want out of the compiler from anywhere in the application, and I can infer a lot of this. For the time being, I'm mostly hard coding it because it's just one entry I'm trying to hit, and I want to make sure that entry's fetch happens prior to anything else attempting to go off and hit something. So there we go. Cool. Now see, it came up with some entry point. Obviously nothing is working because this isn't real. So in the last thing here, I'm going to pause this one more time, put in our real entry points, and then what we should end up seeing is should inject the remote public configs for a different host application on the fly, which solves the weirdness of everybody has different environment variables. If I'm pulling code from someone else's app, I need that app's environment variables in order to run their code. Again, all of this is really to decentralize as much as possible. So See you in a moment. Wired up the actual endpoint for it to retrieve its environment variables now. So essentially, and what's really cool about this whole mechanism is it does effectively give you a way to completely extend module federation, where the normal get and init API in pretty much every case that I use it in is not enough anymore, and I need ways to drastically extend it or have it do other things, auth, fallbacks, rollbacks, all of that stuff. And this is the perfect way to pretty much pass the Webpack interface back to the host with anything that you want on top of it. It's like almost like an object proxy, where I can resolve it to a fake object that connects it to the real one, but I can add as much metadata or additional, business logic into how Webpack actually resolves a get or an init or a remote to begin with in a completely programmatic manner. So now with the real entry point hooked into this, we can go and look at what my actual source looks like here. So in the actual source of this, I've got, the recommender for right now. I've just got, an if-else on here to reduce potential things that could go wrong. But essentially I'm going to import DAR recommended components from somewhere. DAR needs I need DAR's public configs for the recommendation system to work, so it needs to be able to reach out to it. And now if I, kill this build, run this again, it's going to now hit the public config provider in between doing it. So again, I'm handing over all the responsibility to Webpack during its boot sequence to do all of this additional stuff. So the overhead for an engineer is pretty much, that. To everyone else, it simply just works, and I'm handing over all the logic, all the responsibility to Webpack, and really I'm just augmenting how it resolves a remote and saying, well, before you do that, do 2 extra things in front of doing that. And now what we'll see is instantly my you may also like comes in here, which means I've now federated in this component from somewhere else on the internet, from a different application container entirely, and I've done so without needing 500 lines of logic like I previously did. That has all been replaced with 28 lines of code. Yet I now am able to stitch environment variables together, and I could do anything else that I want in here. I can make this perform additional API calls to determine if it should, if it's in rollback mode, auth, whatever I want, I could bake into this. And the other cool thing as well is if you really wanted to get fancy with it, you could do something like window.config remote and pretty much inject the config remote .get config list, and then I could basically, so while I can't use like require or any utils like that in here, I can feed module federation. So I can go factory.default, and out of this I could, this could equal, some object with all of my configs. So then I could say, cool, this federation interface connect to another federated module that's like the config deploy, pull in the configs from everywhere, figure out what you're supposed to do, then pass those configs to the Webpack interface itself and perform all of this logic that I'm doing here. All of this stuff could be a federated module that gets loaded in, tells Webpack what to do during the process of Webpack instantiating a federated module in the first place. So all of my complexity is gone. I've replaced it with a reduced loop and a way to just go and load my public configs as needed. And now I've got, this loading in from our production system inside of like our basically testing local environment. But this is a real productized feature that I'm loading over the wire, plus any environment variables or other dependencies that it may require and it's all getting loaded in just like that without a problem. So there you go. That's pretty much how simple it was. I mean, overall, this took maybe 20 minutes to perform, and it's solved an enormous level of complexity that we had to before when we were having to step around Webpack because of Next 11 not supporting the import parser on a federated import. So there we go. Hopefully this helps somebody.